If you've been thinking about visiting Japan lately, you may have noticed something strange online. Depending on where you look, you'll find headlines warning that Japan has suddenly changed its entry rules, that tourists are being charged extra simply for being foreign, and that travel costs are starting to rise. Some of these concerns are real, but others are being seriously exaggerated, and a few are simply not true. So, if you're planning a trip to Japan, or even just thinking about one, there are several things you should probably know before booking anything. Because yes, travel in Japan is changing, but not necessarily in the way many people think. You do not need JESTA to enter Japan. Let's start with probably the biggest piece of confusion right now. Over the last few months, several websites and social media posts have claimed that Japan's new electronic travel authorization system, often referred to as JESTA, is now mandatory, and that travelers could even be denied boarding if they don't have it. That information is wrong. Japan has discussed introducing an electronic travel authorization system similar to the American ESTA, or Europe's upcoming ETIAS. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But as of now, nothing has actually changed for regular short-term visitors. Japan's Justice Ministry confirmed earlier this year that JESTA is not expected to launch until at least fiscal year 2028, and even that timeline could still change. Yet, despite that, misinformation spread widely enough online that some travelers reportedly became genuinely worried about upcoming trips, and in a few cases people even reconsidered travel plans altogether. But it really is very simple. If you are coming from one of Japan's visa-exempt countries, including the US, Canada, much of Europe, Australia, Singapore, South Korea, and many others, the rules remain essentially the same. For most travelers, you can still enter Japan visa-free for short stays with a valid passport. That does not mean things will never change. Japan clearly intends to introduce a system eventually, especially as tourism numbers continue to surge. But right now, if you're hearing people say, you can't enter Japan anymore without JESTA, that's simply incorrect. That said, while entry rules haven't changed, some prices absolutely have. Foreigner pricing is starting to spread. One of the more controversial developments in Japan right now involves something people have started calling foreigner pricing. And depending on who you ask, this is either a reasonable response to overtourism or a troubling and maybe even racist trend. Several places in Japan have already begun experimenting with different pricing systems for tourists. At Himeji Castle, one of Japan's most famous historical sites, non-residents of Himeji City now pay significantly more than local residents to enter. The difference in price? Non-residents pay, for adults, about 2,500 yen, while Himeji City residents only pay 1,000 yen. In Okinawa, a famous new theme park reportedly charges foreign visitors higher admission prices. Residents of Japan pay 6,930 yen, while non-residents, which are largely tourists, pay 8,800 yen. And while this is not commonplace for attractions in Japan all over yet, you get the picture regarding admission fees. And for the last year or so, stories have been popping up in tourist hotspots like Tsukiji Fish Market and ski resorts in Hokkaido, where some restaurants have introduced separate pricing aimed specifically at international tourists. There have also been reports of temples and other tourist-heavy businesses quietly adding additional fees for visitors. Now, before people immediately jump to conclusions, there are a few important things worth understanding here. Japan has experienced an absolutely enormous tourism boom. The country has welcomed record visitor numbers recently, and while that has been fantastic for the economy, it has also created genuine strains in some destinations. For example, popular neighborhoods in Kyoto have struggled with crowding like never before. Residents in some tourist areas have complained about congestion, noise, littering, and bad behavior, albeit from a minority of visitors. Local governments have increasingly started looking for ways to manage overtourism without simply discouraging travel altogether. That's one reason some people defend these pricing differences. Their argument is basically this: if tourists are contributing to overcrowding, charging a bit more can help offset infrastructure costs, while also protecting places heavily used by local residents. Plus, this is quite the norm for different pricing for tourists in other countries around the world. Of course, critics see things differently. Many people argue that separate pricing based on nationality feels unfair, especially in a country that has traditionally been viewed as welcoming and relatively straightforward for travelers. And there is a legitimate concern that if this trend spreads too aggressively, along with the Japanese government's recent right-wing bias towards foreigners in general, it could damage Japan's reputation internationally, if it hasn't already. Luckily, at the moment, this is still relatively limited rather than widespread. You're not suddenly going to arrive in Japan and discover every restaurant charging foreigners double, but it is something travelers should be aware of. Some advice: avoiding bad surprises has never been easier. These days, if you have mobile data or Wi-Fi, checking prices and reviews before walking into a restaurant takes only about 30 seconds. And, more importantly, especially for restaurants and attractions, in a country with so many options, there's almost always another place nearby. Japan's departure tax is about to jump. If you are planning a trip to Japan, timing may suddenly matter more than most people realize. Because Japan's departure tax, sometimes jokingly called by some as the sayonara tax, is increasing significantly. Starting July 1st, 2026, the tax will rise from 1,000 to 3,000 yen per person. That might not sound dramatic at first, but once you start adding it up for families, the number gets more noticeable. For a family of 4, that's an additional 8,000 yen compared to the previous system. Depending on exchange rates, that could mean roughly $50 or more added to the cost of your departure. Now, to be fair, many countries charge airport taxes and tourism fees in one form or another, and Japan's fee is still far from the highest internationally. But if you're trying to stretch a travel budget, especially for larger families, this becomes one of those small costs that suddenly adds up. And because many airline fees are bundled into ticket pricing, some travelers may not even immediately notice where the extra expense is coming from. So, if your travel dates are flexible and you've been debating when to go, leaving before July could genuinely save you some money. That said, even with rising fees and a few new costs here and there, Japan still remains surprisingly affordable for many foreign travelers. Which brings us to probably the biggest reason tourism continues to boom in Japan. Japan is still a remarkably good deal. Despite all the headlines about rising costs, depending on where you're from, Japan is still much cheaper than many people expect. For travelers coming from places like the USA, Canada, Australia, or much of Western Europe, the weak yen continues to make an enormous difference. Right now, the exchange rate remains historically favorable compared with pre-pandemic levels, and what that means in practical terms is simple. Your money goes much further than it used to. A very good ramen lunch can still cost around only $6. And craft beer, most importantly, in many places is cheaper than people expect. Business hotels in smaller cities, and even in Tokyo, yes, even Tokyo, can sometimes still be found in the $40 to $50 range if you book strategically. Transportation, while not exactly cheap, often feels more reasonable when viewed through the current exchange rate. While the Shinkansen or bullet train is a bit expensive, especially for the new pricing of the JR Pass, local trains and buses are very affordable. This is one of the major reasons Japan saw record tourism numbers recently. For many years, people thought of Japan as fascinating but expensive. And while it certainly can be expensive if you want luxury hotels and high-end sushi or premium shopping, Japan today is actually one of the better travel values among developed countries. You can eat extremely well without spending much. Convenience store food is surprisingly good, and domestic travel infrastructure is excellent. And even budget travelers can have an incredible experience without constantly worrying about money. And oddly enough, this right now may actually be one of the best windows to visit. If you've been waiting for the right moment to visit Japan, there is a strong argument that we might be in it right now. Golden Week, one of Japan's busiest domestic travel periods, has already ended. You definitely want to avoid Japan during peak domestic holiday season. That means hotel prices in many areas have started dropping again, crowds have thinned out compared to peak spring travel, and the weather in much of the country is about as comfortable as Japan gets. Temperatures are still mild, humidity has not yet become overwhelming, and mainland Japan's rainy season usually does not fully settle in until early June. Meanwhile, in places like Hokkaido, some late cherry blossoms are still around depending on timing. In other words, there is this brief seasonal window where Japan becomes quieter, cheaper, and more comfortable all at once. But that combination does not last very long, because once summer arrives, you get heavier crowds, rising temperatures, higher humidity, and eventually another jump in travel demand. So despite the new fees, the pricing controversies, and the confusion online, there is also a very strong case that Japan remains one of the best travel opportunities right now. So if you take anything away from this video, it's probably this. No, you do not suddenly need JESTA to visit Japan. Yes, some new costs and pricing changes are starting to appear. And yes, travel to Japan may gradually become more expensive over time. But despite all of that, Japan is still surprisingly affordable for many international visitors, and right now may actually be one of the best times to go. If you've been considering a trip, this may be the moment to seriously start planning. And if you've recently been to Japan, let me know in the comments. Did it still feel affordable to you? Or are you starting to notice prices changing? And as always, if you enjoyed the video and want more updates about Japan, traveling there, news, and life here, make sure to subscribe.